Chapter 1341. In the Dream. After regaining her senses, Audrey maintained her faint smile as she became wary. She could vaguely feel a mysterious force pushing her to Heartlark, the village with the tradition of dragon worship. This was like an arrangement of fate. Audrey had once entered the Hall of Truth, and she discovered that the murals inside had turned into reality. Furthermore, she knew that the Spectator Pathway Sequence 1 was author. From this name, she had made some connections, so it was inevitable for her to suspect that something was amiss. At this moment, Hibbert laughed.
I've heard of this village. I remember that our family has a manor nearby.
As he spoke, he looked up at the sky.
It's almost evening. Why don't we stay there and continue hunting tomorrow?
Alfred wasn't opposed to his elder brother's suggestion. To him, staying the night at whichever manor was essentially the same. He nodded and said,
"Send someone back to inform father and mother."
Audrey didn't say a word. Her green eyes turned slightly, and her gaze swept across the faces of her two brothers. Hibbert's brows immediately furrowed as he said,
I think it's best we return. This manor wasn't informed in advance, so they definitely weren't prepared. Perhaps there's no way for them to service so many horses, hounds, and servants. Besides, there's still an hour before the evening. There's enough time for us to return.
When Alfred saw his brother change his mind so quickly, he wanted to act contrary to him. However, on second thought, he felt that what his brother said made sense. Considering that his sister was also here, he tersely agreed and said,
"Then let's head back quickly."
With that said, he didn't wait for Hibbert. Squeezing at the horse's side and brandishing the horsewhip, he led the way. Hibbert frowned, then relaxed. Without saying anything else, he led his sister, the group of attendants, servants, and hounds, and turned around, following the edge of the forest and returning to a manor on the other side. Audrey quietly followed behind him, not expressing her opinion on the development of the matter. Late at night, in a manor in East Chester County, having used her manipulator powers to change the thoughts of her two brothers to prevent them from approaching Heartlark, Audrey lifted the velvet blanket and crawled into bed, entering a deep sleep. In her reverie, she suddenly sat up. She then looked around and saw the familiar dressing table and the bathroom entrance. She realized that she was still in the room, but the crimson moon outside the window was gone. There were no stars, only darkness.
This isn't the real world.
Audrey instantly made a judgment and inspected herself. Soon, she came to a conclusion.
This was a dream. It was a rather strange dream that made her remain lucid, Torwar and Ahara. It's really here.
Audrey didn't feel any panic. She was just a little vexed. She hadn't handled the development properly in the afternoon, which led to the problem extending to the manor where her parents were. In hindsight, she believed that she should have followed Hibbert's idea and headed straight to the family manor near Heartlark. Then she could reasonably arrange for Hibbert and Alfred to return here, leaving her to stay behind and wait for any possible developments. This way, even if anything happened, it wouldn't affect their parents, brothers, and most of the servants. However, at that time, her main goal wasn't to follow the arrangement of fate. As long as she could avoid Heartlark, she would try her best to avoid it. To her surprise, danger would, at times, spring on you even if you didn't seek it out. To avoid it and stall for time wasn't a universal solution. Audrey immediately got off the bed and stood barefoot on the thick carpet. She had already confirmed that, with her level of a demigod as a dreamwalker, she could directly escape this strange dream and return to the real world, avoiding the suspected invitation once more. After looking around, Audrey pursed her lips, removed the blue cloak hanging on the clothes rack beside her, and wore it. She took a deep breath and walked towards the door. During this process, a crimson star tattoo appeared on the back of her hand. The tattoo vanished as though it had never appeared. This was the mark left on her after her first entry into the ancient palace above the gray fog. For a very long time, it hadn't shown any special traits. It was only at the beginning of this year that Mr. Fool informed them that in situations in which they couldn't pray, they could use the triggering of the corresponding tattoo to skip the chanting of the honorific name. Simply put, this was a treatment that a blessed of a deity enjoyed, Of course, there was no way to transmit any information. It could only be used in critical situations, allowing Mr. Fool to cast his gaze over. And more importantly, the star-like crimson mark was rather eye-catching. It could be easily discovered by others and people who were secretly monitoring them. Therefore, under a situation where she needed to hide her uniqueness, Audrey was more inclined to use the various abilities of a manipulator to implant the idea of praying to Mr. Fool to some inconspicuous human nearby. She got them to complete the prayer at suitable times and locations and pray for her protection. At this moment, she believed that the owner of the dreamscape knew that she was problematic, so she felt that there was no need to go through all that trouble. All she needed to do was to hide the entity she was praying to. When she reached the door, Audrey reached out for the handle and gently twisted it before pulling it backward. The slightly dark corridor entered her vision. The main building of this manor had a history of over 100 years. Many places still had their former characteristics, especially the corridor section. It didn't have any gas lamps, and the walls were decorated with candle stands made of silver or copper. There were countless candles placed on them, emitting a dim yellow light that illuminated the entire corridor and creating all kinds of shadows. They gave a feeling that a phantasm might appear on the corridor at any moment.
Even this has been replicated in the dreamscape.
Audrey looked around and entered the corridor. As this thought flashed across her mind, a long, thick, pale yellow carpet appeared beneath her feet. Stepping on the carpet, Audrey followed her spiritual intuition and walked to the right. After taking 2 or 3 steps, she suddenly stopped. She felt as if there was something hidden behind the 2 tightly shut doors, giving her a strong desire to explore.
This is Father and Mother's bedroom. That is Hibbert's room. That is Alfred's room.
Audrey made a slight note of it and frowned. The ancient doors with relief were extremely mysterious under the dim candlelight. It made one eager to know what was hidden behind them. As her thoughts raced, Audrey suddenly understood what they represented in a dream. This was the door to the mind world. Behind each door was the mind world of their owner. In other words, after Audrey pushed open Alfred's door, she would see the various secrets hidden deep in his heart. By the same logic, she could pry into the secrets of Lord Hall and Lady Catelyn. She slowly retracted her gaze. Audrey closed her eyes and continued walking forward, preventing herself from being affected. After all her experiences, she gradually understood a principle. A demigod in the mind domain needed to control themselves and respect others. Under the premise that she could read people's true thoughts through their body language, facial expressions, and emotional fluctuations, if she wasn't satisfied, she could greedily explore the inner thoughts of others and dig out their secrets. In the end, she would suffer a backlash. This was a very simple principle. Everyone had some darkness in them, in varying amounts or nasty thoughts. However, they had control over them, preventing them from affecting their actions. Under such circumstances, if a demigod in the mind domain still insisted on digging these thoughts and dug out the ugly parts under the mask, it was very easy for them to be disappointed in human nature, be tainted by all kinds of negative thoughts, gradually becoming crazy without realizing it. This was also one of the reasons why, despite spectators being able to placate themselves and treat corresponding mental problems, they were also one of the pathways who would easily go mad or lose their composure. They were both safe and dangerous. Therefore, Audrey established rules for herself to observe. She only did observations and read the minds of people she knew. She tried her best not to enter their dreams. This restriction didn't apply to strangers. If it wasn't necessary, she wouldn't enter the mind world of anyone. Following the corridor, Audrey, who was wearing a blue cloak, reached its end. She opened her eyes and cast her gaze at the room on the left. It was a half-open solarium. Pursing her lips again, Audrey held the door handle with her breathing steady. As the wooden door opened, the scene inside was gradually revealed. This was no longer a room. On the ground were round pebbles and bundles of bluish-black weeds. It was so dark deep within that space that one couldn't see clearly. Audrey slowly walked in and closed the door behind her. In the darkness, the silhouettes of some objects were quickly outlined. A huge stone pillar that was tens of meters tall stood there. There was a tall, lizard-like monster situated above it. The monster was squatting at the top of the stone pillar like a tiny mountain. Its body was covered with huge grayish-white stone scales, and its eyes were pale, fold, and vertical. This was a mind dragon, as spoken in myths. With a whoosh, the two wings of the mind dragon spread open, almost covering the entire sky. Their bones were like metallic leaf veins, covered with a gray membrane with mysterious patterns. As Audrey looked up, the mind dragon emitted a buzzing sound. "You've been to Liveseed." Without a doubt, it used Dragonese.
City of Miracles, Liveseed. How does it know?
Just as Audrey had these two thoughts, she heard the mind dragon say, "Everyone's consciousness in one's heart will make a certain exchange with the sea of collective subconscious. And for a unique place like Liveseed, it likewise left a special impression in you. When your virtual persona foams the sea of collective subconscious and isn't too far from me, I can naturally sense this."
This exceeds the limits of my abilities, and it's not something a Dreamweaver can do. This mind dragon corresponds to a Sequence 2 discerner? He actually didn't directly control me?
As Audrey's thoughts flashed, the mind dragon spoke again. "I'm sure you don't have any ill intentions at the moment?" Audrey fell silent for 2 seconds before looking up and asking,
Aren't you worried that it's a trap?
Chapter 1342, simultaneously. At that moment, Audrey even suspected that the arrangement of fate wasn't for her to head to Heartlark to investigate the dragon-worshipping customs. Instead, it was to make her realize that something was wrong, causing her to feel conflicted. It made her use a virtual persona in the vicinity of Heartlark to secretly guide her two brothers into changing their minds without realizing it. This would inevitably result in her consciousness being specially related to Liveseed to be discovered by the mind dragon, thus attracting him. Despite being the one that had been arranged, Audrey couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. It had to be said that to achieve such an effect, one had to have an extremely high level of confidence in the reactions different people had. It struck fear into the bottom of her heart. After all, Audrey, a Sequence 4 manipulator, had felt that the development of the matter was in line with her expectations. She had completely fulfilled her wishes and wasn't alert at all. The mind dragon retracted its huge wings and looked down at the blue-cloaked Audrey. "This is a dream maze formed by many minds. Even if the one who set the trap personally descends, it will take some time to find this room. Besides, I won't stay long." Clearly, he had been wary of traps, but he believed that certain matters were worth the risk. Dream maze. This is a beyonder power of a Dreamweaver. Or perhaps the power after a qualitative change. Audrey reined in her thoughts and asked calmly,
What do you wish to know?
The gigantic grayish-white dragon buzzed and said, "My name is Arihog, one of the 3 remaining ancient dragons." He means that he is one of the 3 surviving dragons of the Second Epoch, and the rare, known dragons are only descendants of the dragons during the era of the ancient gods? Audrey nodded slightly and didn't interrupt him. Behind her was a wooden door that stood without any support in the plains filled with bluish-black weeds. It looked extremely strange. Arihog didn't waste any time. After introducing himself, he asked, "Where did you find Liveseed?" Audrey was already prepared, as she answered frankly,
In a book named Grozel's Travels. Rumor has it that it was personally created by the Dragon King Enkwelt.
Grosel. Arihog clearly hadn't heard of this name before. After repeating it, he pressed, "What kind of book is that?" The blonde-haired Audrey gave a simple description.
That's a book with a world that's almost real inside it. At the same time, it can suck in people who meet the requirements, or offer their own blood to be sucked in by the book, allowing them to live in that world.
Arihog fell silent for 2 seconds. Is there a sea of collective subconscious in that book world? Audrey answered with great certainty.
Yes, the City of Miracles, Liveseed, I saw was deep in the sea of collective subconscious in the book world.
Arihog suddenly breathed harder. What did you see in that Liveseed? Audrey recalled and said,
A city filled with towering pillars and majestic palaces. In addition, I've also entered the residence of the Dragon King. That place can allow every living being's inner thoughts to echo in the surrounding area. I call it the Hall of Truth. At the end of the Hall of Truth, behind the Dragon King's throne, there's an ancient and mysterious bronze door. I'm not sure what's sealed behind. In short, it's very dangerous, and I didn't dare approach it at all.
Audrey was speaking the complete truth. She just didn't mention the speculations that Mr. World, Mr. Star, and she had come up with. Airy Hog fell completely silent. It was unknown what he was thinking of, or if he was analyzing the current situation regarding Liveseed. During this process, his head drooped down bit by bit, as though he was going to fall from the top of a 100-meter-tall pillar to the ground. Just as Audrey tensed up from this rather bizarre scene and was about to ask a question, Airy Hog suddenly raised his head. The golden vertical pupil in his eyes turned colder as his voice once again resounded in the wilderness. Liveseed. With a low rumbling of thunder, the things that were hidden in the dark behind Airy Hog quickly became clear. In the gradually brightening scene, their outlines appeared. They were huge stone pillars that were more than 100 meters tall. They were either standing alone or collectively propping up numerous majestic and ancient palaces. These stone pillars and palaces were mainly grayish-white in color as they landed on the island-like foundations. It was identical to the City of Miracles Liveseed, which Audrey had just described. No, this was probably the City of Miracles Liveseed. Only then did Audrey realize that the ancient mine dragon, Airy Hog, was squatting at the top of the thickest, tallest stone pillar. At this moment, she could faintly feel a subtle change in Airy Hog. Her green eyes darted about slightly, and the sound of a metal handle being twisted sounded from behind her. This. Audrey held back the urge to turn her head abruptly. She turned her body warily to the side, allowing her gaze to fall sideways. The individual wooden door that had lost its external support slowly opened, revealing the visitor's appearance. A huge, white rabbit with wiggling ears that walked upright. Above the gray fog in the ancient palace, a figure was shrouded in grayish-white fog. He sat at the fool's seat at the end of the long, mottled table as he silently observed the crimson star representing justice. Backland, Westboro, 9 Bellotto Street. The closer Wendell was to the end of the 2 weeks, the more he suffered from insomnia. He had to rely on medication to fall asleep. When he woke up, he was also restless and extremely anxious. He had lost all interest in food and only forced himself to eat the 3 meals sent by his colleagues to ensure his energy. He didn't know what would happen on the date of the trial, nor did he know if there would be an irreversible change in his body. This kind of fear towards the unknown often made him feel stifled. It was extremely tortuous. Sometimes, Wendell would even think that it might not be a wise choice, resisting his return to Utopia. Based on his limited experience there, if he obediently returned to Utopia and testified in court, there was a high chance that he would leave safely. At least up to this point, Wendell hadn't heard of anyone dying or going crazy because of Utopia. The people there were rather friendly, apart from being a little bizarre. I'm just going to help. They should be grateful to me instead of being antagonistic. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it would be more comfortable to face the danger. Of course, he had no doubts about MI9's protective capabilities. If it wasn't possible, he felt that he could only consider meeting the Lord of Storms early. Phew, Wendell exhaled and sat down on his chair. He casually picked up a novel to pass time, Kauras non BM. However, his frustration made it impossible for him to immerse himself in the plot. He flipped through the pages more frequently, and finally, he snapped the book close. Fatsa, he closed his eyes and prepared to take a nap. In a daze, Wendell seemed to return to Utopia and arrived at the court. However, the role he was in wasn't as a witness, but a member of the audience. Tracy was deemed by the judge to have provided insufficient evidence to support a claim for self-defense and had been transferred to the criminal courts. He saw this lady tearing up in a daze, her smile extremely miserable. Wendell woke up and stared silently at the wall lamp in front of him. He sat there motionless for a long time. If the problem is Utopia and not the residents of Utopia, then me avoiding it might end up killing a poor lady. Wendell retracted his gaze. His resolve had wavered slightly, but he was unable to overcome the fear in his heart. With his hands on the table, he stood up and walked to the door. He planned to wander about MI9's headquarters to ease his mood. After leaving the room and taking a few steps forward, Wendell suddenly heard a colleague in the office discussing the related case of the Utopia. "Have you heard? The person who entered Utopia was a carriage driver. He sent a merchant from Utopia to the dock area, and with just taking 2 turns at a crossroads, he found himself somewhere unfamiliar. There's a need to warn all the carriage drivers in Backland. Yes, it's best to draw a parallel between Utopia and the spies, so that they can understand. The way of entering and exiting Utopia is really frightening. Yes, sometimes I even suspect that the entrance to Utopia might appear anywhere. There's definitely a limit to this. It's not as omnipotent as we imagine. Otherwise, I might find myself in Utopia just by paying a visit to the washroom. According to the current patterns we've figured, this is theoretically valid." When Wendell heard that, his blood vessels on his forehead began to throb. He suddenly felt that even if he was in the headquarters of MI9, he wouldn't be that safe. "Unless there's a demigod watching me the entire time, it's very difficult for me to avoid the fate of returning to Utopia. Perhaps, after I wash my hands and open the washroom door, I'll discover that it's the Iris's Hotel outside. No, ordinary demigods might not be able to stop such a thing. This doesn't seem like it's something humans can accomplish. It's already extremely close to that of a deity." Wendell instantly panicked, unable to suppress the fear in his heart. He returned to the room and took out the subpoena from the Utopian court. Immediately following that, Wendell entered the washroom and held the document as he muttered in fear. "I'm willing to go to court to testify. I'm willing to go to court to testify." Pause. After repeating himself a few times, he reached out to grab the handle of the bathroom door. At that moment, a black raven flew through the ventilation hole like a ghost and landed in a corner of the washroom that no one would notice. In the next second, Wendell twisted the handle, pulled the door back, and opened the washroom door. It was no longer his familiar bedroom, but an unfamiliar lobby. Chapter 1343, Weaved Nightmare. I really returned to Utopia. Upon seeing the scene outside, Wendell felt a baffling sense of relief and ease. He no longer had any doubts about his choice to go to testify in court. It had to be known that he was in the washroom of MI9's headquarters. It was a place that was impossible to invade, even with a fully armed army. Wendell slowly exhaled as he walked out of the washroom and towards the entrance of the lobby. Behind him, in a corner of the washroom where no one was paying attention to, the pitch-black raven had draped over a shadow-like veil, losing its physical presence. Even if one were to directly look at it, it would be difficult to discover it. Then, its body became more and more transparent as it rapidly dissipated until it vanished. At this moment, Wendell had already walked a few meters out of the lobby when he saw a police officer in a black and white checkered uniform. This was the young officer who had requested him to testify, Biles. Biles smiled at Wendell. "I knew you'd come, because you're a kind person." When he heard the compliment, Wendell's strung-up heart finally returned to normal. Then, he instinctively turned his head back and saw that the bathroom that he had come out of had changed completely in style. It was no longer familiar to him.
Mr. Wrath.
In the dream maze formed by many minds, the huge white rabbit that walked upright squeezed through the open door and entered the vast wilderness with the grayish-white pillars and magnificent palaces. Although it wasn't wearing the persona mask, its unforgettable characteristics were enough for Audrey to recognize him at a glance. This was out of her expectations, but it wasn't too surprising. From her point of view, just Mr. Wrath alone likely wasn't enough to deal with an ancient mind dragon like Arihog. Even if Mr. Fool had warned her to be wary of Mr. Wrath. After all, the leader behind the psychology alchemists, the former king of angels, had already become a Sequence Zero true god. According to the knowledge shared by the Tarot Club, there shouldn't be any other author beyonders in the real world. This way, no matter how powerful Mr. Wrath was, as long as it was still part of the spectator pathway, it would at most be on the same level as Arihog. The only things that would differ were combat experience, psychological research, and self-cultivation. At this moment, as the giant white rabbit entered, the large, grayish-white, scaled Arihog spread open his wings which covered his skin. The surrounding area was instantly covered in a shadow. With a leap, the white rabbit's legs suddenly became extremely huge, like a tiny hill. At the same time, the gloomy sky above him lit up. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, spewing out crimson lava. Immediately after, a blurry and distorted figure appeared behind it. This figure was dressed in a simple white robe. It was difficult to see his face clearly, and it was impossible to tell his age. One could only vaguely tell that he was a man. A bright halo hung at the back of his head like a miniature sun. Beneath his feet was an illusory clock that was divided into 12 segments. Each segment represented a different symbol of time. Behind him, there was a shadow that looked like a curtain. Eyes seemed to be looking out from the shadow. Just after this figure appeared, the entire dream maze shook violently, and gray fragments fell from the void. The contrast of depravity and pure sunlight rapidly spread around the huge white rabbit, eroding or assimilating the area. However, that simple white-robed figure had trouble truly taking shape. He was unable to enter reality from history and illusions. Every time his silhouette became clear, his figure would distort like a machine that had its signal disrupted. At that moment, Audrey instinctively retracted her gaze, not daring to look directly at the huge white rabbit. Perhaps it was because she was in a dream and was closely connected to the mind island and the sea of collective subconscious. She didn't need anyone to explain to her because she knew what Mr. Wrath was doing. The other party knew the latent psychological problems of Arihog and knew what he feared the most. Then, according to this, it produced a nightmare that contained the specific images. In a battle between high-sequence beyonders of the spectator pathway, if both parties were at the same level, it would be difficult to produce any true effects using the various means available to them. One could sneak into the island of consciousness and attempt deep hypnosis. The other could guard the door to the body of heart and mind, preventing any foreign consciousness from entering. The other could spread a mental plague and use the sea of collective subconscious to intrude on the enemy without them realizing it. The other would be able to placate themselves, treat the psychological ailments, and maintain their mental health. Therefore, the battle between same-sequence spectator saints often had 3 fixed styles. First, set up a trap ahead of time as a multi-pronged attack preparation. Then, by secretly leading on and guiding the opponent, one could break down their mental defenses in one strike and complete the hypnosis. Second, one focused on their physical defense and as support, relying on powerful sealed artifacts to defeat their enemy. Third, when the Beyonder powers, such as mental plague, mind deprivation, dragon's breath, consciousness control, and other Beyonder powers were unable to deal with their opponent, engaging in self-hypnotism and using dragon transformation would result in an intense melee battle that exchanged claw swipes and tail lashes. In the third battle, whoever had a deeper understanding of the mind domain and whose will was stronger and firmer would be able to gain the upper hand by relying on the extended usage of dragon transformation. Of course, the prerequisite was that the other party had no chance of escaping, and at the level of an angel, everyone was a true mythical creature. The maintenance time of dragon transformation became meaningless. At this moment, it mainly depended on observation. Whoever could find a flaw in the opponent's mind could weave a corresponding nightmare, directly attacking the enemy's weaknesses, slowly destroying their mental defenses, and reaching the effect of going mad or dying out of fear. As Audrey was in the same dream, even if the nightmare wasn't directed at her, she was still affected by the corresponding emotions, characteristics, status, and even corruption. Now she clearly knew that the nightmare that Mr. Wrath had weaved represented the ancient sun god. This was the most terrifying existence in Arihog's mind. At the same time, the ancient sun god's influence would uncontrollably corrupt the surroundings until it reached the entire dream. When the time came, once Audrey woke up, she would either become an untreatable mentally ill patient or she would become an incomplete mythical creature, completely losing all reason and ending up wildly attacking the surrounding creatures. Of course, there was another possibility that she unknowingly became depraved. She would become cold, cruel, and bloodthirsty without realizing it, as if someone had replaced her. At this moment, Arihog, who was squatting at the top of the grayish-white pillar, let out a painful howl. As the dragon's roar echoed, the top of his head turned dark, revealing a sea of secrets and colors that was difficult to describe with words. In the sea, an even bigger grayish-white dragon, spanning 1,000 meters long, rose up. One of his vertical pupils was pale gold, and the other was bright red color. There was a third eye on the dragon's forehead. It seemed to be hiding a thick shadow. Similarly, there was no need for anyone to explain. With the uniqueness of her present state, Audrey immediately knew what nightmare Arihog had weaved. This was something that left a deep trauma in the giant white rabbit's heart. This was the Ankwelt that had been corrupted by the underground world. This was the virtual persona and mental corruption which was sealed behind the bronze door, things that had been split off from that ancient god. At that moment, Audrey was in an indescribable nightmare. Although she hadn't been corrupted, her mental state was in turmoil, as though she had been awed. She immediately used placate on herself and didn't hesitate to rely on her own consciousness to forcefully escape the dream maze. During this process, she didn't encounter any obstruction, not just because she wasn't Arihog's and Mr. Wrath's target, but also because she had reached Sequence 4 and possessed a certain amount of godhood. Therefore, she quickly woke up from her dream. Audrey suddenly opened her eyes and saw a crystal chandelier dyed in faint crimson. She saw the deep darkness of the room. Without any delay, she got out of bed and ran to the window to look outside. The entire manor was completely silent, as if it was deep asleep. Everything was normal. Audrey frowned and immediately split out a virtual person, allowing it to enter the mind island of a night-pat roller. She remembered very clearly that the dream maze was formed by many minds. Once the two nightmares spread, the result was unimaginable. Therefore, before this, she had to wake up everyone in the manor. In the next second, the patrolling guard suddenly raised his hand and removed the grenade hanging from his belt. He pulled out the pin and threw it towards an empty garden. Boom! The loud explosion jolted awake the sleeping people. Immediately after, the guard shouted loudly, "Enemy assault! Enemy assault!" Earl Hall and his wife were already over 50 years old, so as light sleepers, they jolted awake immediately. Regardless of how good Hibbert's sleep quality was, he woke up in a reverie thanks to such a loud explosion. Alfred had opened his eyes the moment the grenade was thrown. The remaining butler, maids, footmen, and bodyguards woke up one after another. They looked confused and dumbfounded, not knowing what had happened. And at the far end of the manor's main building, a few servants heard the commotion and didn't wake up in time. A few seconds later, they struggled on the bed in pain. Like a snake shedding its skin, they broke free from their skin, turning into hideous bodies of blood. They didn't wake up until they died. At that moment, Audrey saw a grayish-white dragon spread its wings in the sea of collective subconscious. As it rapidly departed, a huge white rabbit followed closely behind. In the blink of an eye, the dragon's voice resounded in the illusory sea. Adam isn't necessarily Adam, just like how I might not necessarily be Arihog. The giant white rabbit suddenly slowed down and gradually stopped. All the abnormalities came to an end as the entire area returned to normal. In the ancient palace above the fog,
Adam didn't attack?
the fool Klein frowned slightly as he turned his attention back to Utopia and replaced the instinctual monitoring of the worms of spirit. He carefully inspected his marionette town and didn't find anything abnormal. Chapter 1344, Humanity. Seeing that there weren't any abnormalities in the town of marionettes, Klein began thinking about Miss Justice's encounter.
It wasn't Adam who set up an attack against Arihog. But Hermes? Who masterminded it? Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible for Adam to not descend. It would also be impossible for Arihog to escape so easily. He had to rely on the Second City of Miracles to have some hope of doing so. If Hermes was the mastermind, the development of this whole episode becomes logical. Hermes never thought of capturing or killing Arihog. He only hopes to learn some information from this ancient mind dragon. When Arihog said Adam isn't necessarily Adam, the operation came to a natural end. Yes, from the looks of it, Hermes already had some doubts about Adam's true state. However, due to the limitations of his status, he has been unable to make Arihog appear on his own accord, so he used Miss Justice. Adam isn't necessarily Adam. Arihog isn't necessarily Arihog. This sentence is very interesting. The upper echelons of the spectator pathway are more mysterious than seers. Back then, Dragon of Imagination Ankewelt clearly occupied Sequence 0, but he had a Sequence 1 son of the same pathway as him, Dragon of Nightmare, Alzahad. If Adam really isn't Adam, then who is he? Is it that Adam from the myth in the time before the first epoch, or part of the primordial one? Or is he related to the resurrection of the ancient sun god? From the looks of it, the meaning behind why Medici addresses him as a zealot has a far more profound meaning.
Klein quickly conjured a gold coin and flicked it into the air, making a divination. The results of the divination indicated that today's development was nothing dangerous. Klein immediately dispersed the gold coin and prepared to descend his consciousness into his body beneath St. Ariana Cathedral. At this moment, his actions became slightly sluggish. The moment Miss Justice met Arihog and Hermes was almost simultaneous as the moment the MI9 personnel returned to Utopia to testify in court. Just looking at them individually, there was no problem. But the word simultaneous made Klein somewhat alert. He was very sensitive to words like happen to, coincidence, simultaneous, and almost the same. This was a mark left behind by his past experiences. He tapped his finger on the edge of the long mottled table and decided to make preparations for his worries. He quickly condensed a light that contained certain words and some kind of will, and he threw it into a prayer light. After doing this, Klein made his consciousness sink and left Saphira Castle, allowing his mind to return to his original body. Immediately after, he began to influence Utopia. He planned to use all sorts of arrangements to temporarily make all the foreigners leave. This way, even if anything happened, it wouldn't affect the innocent. This also meant that Klein was prepared to abandon Utopia and change locations to rebuild his marionette town. After all, a ritual could be repeated many times, but he could only afford one resurrection. Have a good rest for the next 2 days. There's still some time left before court begins. Biles sent Wendell to the entrance of the Irises Hotel. Wendell replied with a smile, "I'm already feeling sleepy." It was in the middle of the night. He had trouble sleeping previously because of his anxiety and nervousness. That was why he thought of walking around the headquarters of MI9 to ease his mood. However, when he heard the conversation between his colleagues at night, it triggered an eruption in his emotions, and he decided to return to Utopia and face the problem. After checking in, Wendell took his luggage and went to the 3rd floor. When he passed through the door, he vaguely felt that his surroundings were abnormally dark. In order to sleep better, Wendell walked to the window and drew the curtains. During this process, he felt that the scenery outside the window was unusually familiar. However, under the cover of the night, he couldn't tell what was happening too clearly. Thinking that it might have been the scene he had seen in Utopia previously, he covered his mouth with his hand and yawned. He took off his clothes and walked towards the bed. Monica slept until midnight when she suddenly needed to pee. Unable to hold it in any longer, she eventually got out of bed and walked towards her room's attached bathroom. When she pushed the bathroom door open, she found it a little heavier. Rubbing her eyes that were almost unable to open, Monica didn't care about this small change. She quickly relieved herself and ran out of the bathroom to her bed. When she entered the covers, she felt that the temperature was much lower and she had no choice but to wrap herself up tightly in layers. It didn't take long for her to fall asleep again. About 15 minutes later, the patrolling Biles rubbed his hands and turned towards the street where the police station was. He was about to hand over duties with his colleagues. Suddenly, his body froze in the alley. The black and dense spirit body threads on his body peeled off at the same time as they floated upwards. A pruned and exquisite paper figurine landed and connected to the spirit body threads, quickly turning into another Biles. At the same time, a torrent of mixed knowledge surged over and reassembled him into a man wearing gorgeous clothes with long chestnut hair. The man had blue eyes, a high-nose bridge, and thin lips. It was Roselle Gustav's Sequence 1 historical projection. Right on the heels of that, the projection reached out and sucked all the information in the surroundings into its palm, forming an illusory ball of light. This information included all the details that involved Biles. In the next second, Roselle Gustav's historical projection forged a piece of information that was completely normal, allowing it to follow the spirit body threads connected to the paper figurine to the St. Ariana Cathedral in the municipal square, moving straight underground of the cathedral. After this series of actions, another torrent of information surged in midair. With Roselle's help, they reformed into 3 figures: a middle-aged man wearing a black robe and a hood with a long, thick white beard. Another, who was draped in a cloak, had black hair, blue eyes, and a rather squarish face. He was a middle-aged man with a dignified bearing. On one of the trees, there was a huge tree that seemed to be drenched with petroleum. On the tree, there were arms with all sorts of strange protruding objects that rolled with bloodshot eyes. They were the leader of the secret order, Zaratul; Lowen's protector, the first king, William Augustus I's historical projection, a historical projection of abomination Sua. After making the necessary preparations, Zaratul used the location provided by the historical projection to sneak into Utopia. He didn't waste any time. He reached out with his right hand and used the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics to suck out the worm of spirit in Biles. Elsewhere, the palm of Abomination Sua's historical projection made an ugly doll the size of a palm appear. The doll was wet and sticky. It had no eyes, ears, or nose. It only had a pinhole-like mouth that emitted and sucked grayish-white fog. As the worm of spirit and the doll approached, the black and white eyeballs that rolled out on the Sua tree trunk looked at them at the same time. Silently, the worm of spirit fused with the ugly doll, causing it to distort as it squirmed, growing out eyes, nose, and ears, making it look like Klein Moretti. At this point, Zaratul no longer did any concealment, nor could he do so. He took out a black shroud and abruptly wrapped Klein's doll up. All the marionette spirit body threads in Utopia were severed at the same time. They were unable to connect to the true body. This wasn't because there was something wrong with them, but that the true body was isolated from them. All of a sudden, the duty personnel in the police station, tenants in the hotel, Tracy and the thieves in the cell, Anderson in another apartment, Alzu, and the other citizens all stopped breathing and turned stiff. Regardless of whether they were sleeping or doing something else, it was as if a pause button had been pressed. Klein, who was at the bottom of St. Ariana Cathedral, suddenly woke up. He knew that an accident had happened. He didn't hesitate. With a thought, he returned to Sapphira Castle. With the level and strength of a king of angels, he was able to resist enemies that had shown or had yet to show themselves. This was the best choice in the current situation. Even if he wasn't able to protect his true body, Klein still had a chance to revive. At that moment, his floating consciousness touched an invisible, dark barrier, making it difficult to penetrate it and enter Sapphira Castle.
This.
Klein's heart tightened, believing that the enemy might be more troublesome than he had imagined. Few high-level existences knew he could return to Sapphira Castle with a thought. In the next second, the thick, petroleum-slathered tree had arrived above St. Ariana Cathedral. In addition, a deep and dignified voice resounded. "Wandering is prohibited here. Teleportation is prohibited here." Klein wasn't led by his emotions. Seeing that he couldn't return to Sapphira Castle at the moment, he immediately changed his strategy and leaped towards the fog of history. The moment the grayish-white fog entered his eyes, it turned into a whirlpool formed by countless transparent maggots. The vortex extended out slippery tentacles covered with strange patterns. Unlike previously, the vortex emitted a powerful suction force, causing Klein's figure to speed up and be entangled by countless tentacles. Law of Beyonder Characteristics Convergence. The law of Beyonder Characteristic Convergence between angels. A subtle beam of light flashed as Klein, who was firmly controlled by Zarathul's mythical creature form, turned into a paper figurine. This was an angel-level application of paper figurine substitutes, as well as the help of grafting. Although Klein couldn't return to Sapphira Castle, he could influence the worms of spirit above the gray fog, allowing them to use the curtain to provide help. After dodging Zarathul's fatal blow, Klein ran into the fog of history and fled towards the former metropolis from a time before the First Epoch. At this moment, many marionettes who had been dead for a long time in Utopia rapidly decayed from losing the spirit-body threads maintaining them. Their limbs dropped to the ground or mutated because of their Beyonder characteristics. The latter transformed into different monsters, ones far more terrifying than imaginable. Some swallowed their heads, others were left with only squirming flesh, while others grew dense eyes. Soon, Klein ran into the old metropolis, situated inside the fog of history. To him, this was a safe room that could be trusted. This was because only a scholar of yore who was a human from before history could enter. Without any hesitation, Klein habitually surveyed the area and began praying to the Evernight goddess in the stacked city. Oof! A faint sound rang out as an ancient wooden stake with traces of blood penetrated Klein's heart from behind. A figure phased into existence behind him. It was a cold-looking man wearing a half-top hat and a black trench coat, Gehrman Sparrow. Klein's pupils dilated as the crazy adventurer said in a deep voice,
Adam has given me humanity.
Chapter 1345, Meeting Again. Klein turned around and looked at the familiar yet unfamiliar figure. He had imagined all kinds of attacks on Utopia, but he had never expected such a scene to occur. If Ammon had parasitized the marionette, Gehrman Sparrow, then, with Klein's current status and the spirit worms on Sapphira Castle, he definitely would have immediately discovered the problem. And if Zarathul were to swap the spirit-body threads, he could only temporarily hide it from him. Furthermore, he needed help from an angel like a knowledge emperor or a servant of concealment to ensure the element of surprise in the sudden attack. Only the humanity provided by a spectator could slowly ferment, without revealing any abnormalities on the surface. To prevent such a situation, he could only sever the spirit-body threads and allow the marionette to deteriorate till it died. That way, regardless of whether it had any humanity in it or not, it would ultimately cease to exist. Unfortunately, Klein had never heard of such methods before. All he did was guard against the invasion of a virtual persona on his marionettes. This might be the power of a visionary, giving life to everything virtual and immaterial, a unique sense of humanity. The carved and cold face was reflected in Klein's eyes as he felt a force pushing him away. He immediately fell backward, falling from the layers of ruins of the old metropolis out from the fog of history. During this process, he wanted to control himself, but there was nothing he could do. This was because the wooden stake at his heart had sealed all his Beyonder powers. With a thought, Klein looked at Gehrman Sparrow and snapped his fingers. Pa! The worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle received his will and gave up the marionette's spirit-body threads. They also picked up the Staff of the Stars and prepared to give Klein a fatal blow so as to commit suicide. After his main body completely died, Klein would be able to revive above the gray fog and escape from his predicament. He no longer held any hope after finding out that Adam was the mastermind behind the scenes. At this moment, a stone square floating in the void appeared beneath Klein's feet. Black stone pillars rose up and propped up a grand and holy cathedral, enveloping Klein inside. The Corpse Cathedral, Adam's Corpse Cathedral, the divine kingdom of a visionary. Boom! Countless bolts of silver lightning smote down from Sapphira Castle, penetrating the fog of history and struck the cathedral, but failed to shake it at all. At the same time, in the ancient palace, the figure sitting in the fool's seat suddenly collapsed to the side, forming a vortex formed from transparent maggots. The vortex extended out slippery and strange tentacles. crazily smacking the surroundings, overturning the junk pile, and destroying the long modeled table. Klein's avatar had lost contact with his true body, and because his true body hadn't really died, they had lost control and went crazy, just like Zeratul from before. In the old metropolis before the first epoch, Gearman Sparrow, who was wearing a half-top hat and a black trench coat, looked up at Sapphira Castle, his expression mixed. He was basically a corpse. After his spirit-body threads were abandoned, he naturally couldn't maintain his existence. The only thing Adam gave him was humanity. There was no envisioned life for him, as that would result in the discovery of there being something wrong with Gearman Sparrow. Gearman Sparrow slowly collapsed as he looked at the rooms in the old metropolis. He died in this ruin. Klein's feet landed on the ground and stood in the middle of the cathedral. He saw that every arch of each pillar was embedded with the skulls of different races. Most of them were pale white in color, as they were packed densely together, staring at the intruder with their hollow eyes. On the walls, windows, and doors of the cathedral, transparent, distorted, and painful faces appeared, separating the interior from the outside world. And in front of the cathedral stood a cross that was more than 100 meters tall. In front of the cross were rows of black pews. Adam, who was wearing a simple white robe and had a pale gold beard, was standing under the cross with a silver cross hanging from his neck. He faced the pews like a priest who was preparing to deliver a sermon. His expression was warm and his eyes were limpid, as though he was only inviting Klein to listen to the scriptures. Klein lowered his head and looked at the cross-shaped wooden stake that was stuck in his chest. He slowly walked to the first pew and sat in the middle. For a true mythical creature formed from many worms of spirit, the wound on its chest wasn't fatal. The main purpose of the ancient bloody cross stake was to seal his beyonder powers. If not for the true God standing in front of him, Klein could have used his physical strength to pull out the wooden stake and remove the seal. At this moment, he didn't make any attempts because he was afraid that he would turn the thought of not daring to show to not willing to. Klein looked at his blood-stained shirt and seriously voiced his doubts.
I didn't expect you to directly interfere in this matter. If you wanted to deal with me, you didn't have to wait until today.
He wasn't afraid at all, as if he was certain that Adam wouldn't kill him. Adam held the silver cross pendant with one hand and calmly said,
"For now, you were able to be of quite some use in many ways."
He took 2 steps forward and continued with limpid eyes.
When Aemon came to steal the Corpse Cathedral, I made a deal with him. By helping me obtain the first blasphemy slate, I'll help him capture you.
Is that so?
Klein was instantly enlightened. On the one hand, Adam didn't wish to be obstructed by existences like the true creator when he became a god, and on the other hand, he wanted to obtain the first blasphemy slate. Therefore, he used the unshadowed crucifix and other methods to give Klein an impetus to head for the Giant King's court, open the door to the chamber where Sassurer was sleeping, and attract the attention of the true creator and other existences. On the other hand, he used his brother Aemon to steal the first blasphemy slate at the critical moment. And to capture Klein, who was about to obtain preliminary control of Sapphira Castle, it would definitely be most appropriate to have a visionary arrange the developments for him. Although Aemon and Adam usually appear distant, they are still brothers and can work together more easily. Klein nodded slightly and looked at the stained glass that had distorted faces.
I also didn't expect Zeratul to cooperate with you. Isn't he afraid of becoming food for Amon?
When Klein established Utopia, he had considered Amon's attack and Zaratul's destruction. However, he never expected that they would work together in a certain way. From his point of view, the chances of Zeratul completely siding with the Mother Tree of Desire were higher than this, unless Adam had unknowingly arranged such a development for him. Adam's limpid eyes showed sympathy.
To him, you becoming a great old one means that he will definitely perish. However, if Aemon becomes one, as long as he expresses his loyalty, he can still retain his present level and status. A Lord of the Mysteries still requires an attendant of mysteries. Therefore, he chose to cooperate with me. During this process, if he can seize the opportunity and turn you into a marionette before I do, using you to enter Sapphira Castle and become the owner of the Sapphira, then he has the right to demand an opportunity to face Antigonus at Evernight's place and have an ultimate showdown with Aemon. On the contrary, he will completely admit defeat and pledge allegiance to Aemon. On this point, he was very decisive.
Klein replied casually before frowning.
It doesn't seem like your style to explain so much. You don't need all the Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics of the corresponding pathway to become a great old one.
He had deduced this from the relationship between the ancient sun god and the 8 kings of angels. However, he believed that one had to first become a great old one or a quasi-one before dividing the characteristics. Theos. Adam replied gently.
For neighboring pathways, all that's needed is a uniqueness and a Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristic. It's easy to lose control if one forcefully occupies more. Therefore, after Zaratul pledged allegiance to Aemon, he still has the chance to become a king of angels. And he isn't able to pledge allegiance to you because he can't separate a Sequence 2 avatar like those from the Marauder pathway. And then, stealing his main body's spirit body, consciousness, and psyche over, turning the avatar into the main body.
This was the qualitative difference between a seer's marionette and a marauder's worm of time. The former involved spirit-body threads, while the latter relied on themselves. Furthermore, the reason the marauder angel could do this was because their Sequence 2 was Trojan Horse of Destiny. Just as Klein nodded, he suddenly saw Adam turn his body, revealing something beneath the cross. It was a gray stone slab. There were many mottled marks on its surface, making it look rather ancient. This was very similar to the first blasphemy slate, but it didn't have that abnormally ancient feeling to it. It also had words that looked like the source of all languages. They were written with the names of sequences and potion formulas. Klein asked in surprise.
The second blasphemy slate?
His gaze quickly swept across the stone slab. He didn't read the first few paragraphs, but instead looked at the last few lines. His intuition told him that there was a very important piece of information there. Hagai mecha mor lashochai, hagai mecha mor lashochai, hagai mecha hai on. Adam acted as though he was consoling a repentant hagai mecha aliyat.
There's no need to rush. Amon has to complete the ritual and become a Sequence 0 before stealing your fate. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to withstand the identity as Sapphira Castle's owner. And before that, it's best to let you continue staying in my kingdom.
Klein muttered inwardly.
Kill me.
At this moment, he figured out the last few lines. God Almighty, Creator, Maker, the Omnipotent and Omniscient, Lord of the Astral World, Sea of Chaos, plus Visionary Uniqueness, plus the Sun Uniqueness, plus Tyrant Uniqueness, plus White Tower Uniqueness, plus the Hanged Man Uniqueness, plus 1 Author Beyonder characteristic, plus 1 White Angel Beyonder characteristic, plus 1 Thunder God Beyonder characteristic, plus 1 Omniscient Eye Beyonder characteristic, plus 1 Dark Angel Beyonder characteristic. Lord of the Mysteries, King of Space-Time, Beacon of Destiny, Embodiment of Sapphira Castle, Dominator of the Spirit World, Sapphira Castle plus the Full Uniqueness, plus Error Uniqueness, plus Door Uniqueness, plus 1 Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder characteristic, plus 1 Worm of Time Beyonder characteristic, plus 1 Key of Stars Beyonder characteristic. Upon seeing this, Klein turned his head to look at Adam and asked in puzzlement,
Why are you showing me these? Wouldn't it be safer to hypnotize me and put me to sleep until Aemon becomes a god?
Adam's eyes were clear as he said with a warm expression.
To be frank, if the other party wasn't Aemon, then I'd be more willing to help you become the dominator of the spirit world. We have too many things in common. In a sense, we are old friends who have met before.
With that said, he smiled and said,
We meet again, Mysteries.